everybody. Welcome. We're going to be spending time in this webinar with one of the greatest musical artists who ever lived, the incomparable, the divine Johann Sebastian Bach. We're going to take a look at three of his works, and in each work we'll be concentrating on just a tiny little slice of the piece. In the first piece that we'll take a look at the Brandenburg Concerto No. 3. We're just going to take a look a little bit at the very beginning of the first movement of this three-movement work, and we'll talk about how Bach's compositional techniques reflect, in many cases, music's fundamental building blocks. Then we'll go to his two-part Invention in D minor, and we'll concentrate on just literally one measure of the piece to examine how Bach follows every musical rule every time, sometimes with surprising results. And then we'll finish up with his monumental Great St. Matthew Passion, since Bach was primarily employed by the church for most of his life. He wrote a lot of sacred music, needless to say, with lots of sacred text, and he was one of the great masters of using music melodically and harmonically to illuminate the text, and no text is more extraordinary than that of the Great St. Matthew Passion. We'll look at one recitative of that work. So let's move right ahead and start with this Brandenburg Concerto No. 3. Here's a facsimile of the first page of the first movement. Let's listen to a little bit of this great concerto. Are one of the greatest and most familiar pieces of Bach's. Let's take a look and just a little bit at this facsimile. You can see the title above. This is what's called the presentation score. Beautifully, the calligraphy is absolutely beautiful. It was a score of one of the 6 concertos that he presented to the Margrave of Brandenburg. So it's done in the most pristine, florid Baroque style. What does the title say? The title says Concerto Terza, third concerto, a tre violini, 3 violins, 3 viole, 3 violas, et 3 violoncelli, and 3 cellos, col basso per il cembalo, with bass and keyboard. And notice here are the 3 violins, 1, 2, and 3, if you notice here on the left. Once again, the 3 violas in the middle, and then the 3 cellos here, followed by the violone, cembalo. Of course, the keyboard player would just be reading this one line and would be providing accompaniment or possibly writing in some figured bass to help with the harmony. But notice that what's extraordinary about this page, and in fact most all of Bach's music, is that all 3 violins are playing exactly the same music, as you see. All 3 violas are playing exactly the same. All 3 cellos, and in fact the bass, all 4 of these lines are exactly the same. Now, does Bach take any shortcuts? Does he just write the first line of the first violin and say, okay, second and thirds, you just play the same as the first. I'm not going to bother writing your part. Same thing with the violas and the cellos and the bass. No, he writes every single note of every single part out. Just think of the labor. It's not like we're inputting into a computer or even using a pencil with an eraser. No, he's got a quill pen that he's got to continue to sharpen. He dips it in the ink for every note, every stem, every beam, every slur, keeps dipping, keeps writing. And do you see any smudges? Do you see any mistakes? None whatsoever. It's actually astonishing. And then think of the entire movement. Think of all 3 movements. Think of all 6 concertos, and then multiply that by hundreds and hundreds of other works of his, and just literally the time that it takes to write the notes. Forget about composing the piece. Is just mind-boggling. The labor that he took to just simply getting the music on the page. So here is the printed version of that, those first 8 or so measures. And we're going to just take a look specifically at the first measure and a half of the piece. The measure and a half of the piece that basically, it's really the first phrase of the piece. One would think that you go from bar line to bar line, but no, the first phrase of the piece actually is 1 measure and a half long. We move to D right in the middle of the first measure. So very interesting, just to begin with, that the first phrase is 1.5 measures. It's not a measure or 2 or 3 or whatever. It's literally 1.5 measures long. And we're going to take a look at what's going on in this first 1.5 measures, going from the bottom up. So what's happening in the bottom? Well, very obviously, octaves. Simple, big interval of an octave. The bass would be, of course, sounding an octave lower. What's happening in the middle? Well, the viola, remember this is viola clef, so that's a G, that's a B, that's a D. Whereas the bottom have the octaves. What are the middle voices? Well, the middle voices have the arpeggio, the blue. And what do our upper voices, our violins, have? Well, they have alternate seconds that descend to all the way to an octave. G, F sharp, G, D, C, B, B, A, B. So, seconds, all the way down to the octave. And what happens in this last part of this first phrase? Everybody's got a scale. The violin's ascending scale, our viola descending scale, and our cello's also descending. And then our fifths are a little bit of a cadence. So lower intervals, the low instruments, big intervals. Middle instruments, middle size intervals. Higher instruments, smallest intervals. Does that remind you of anything? Well, I certainly hope so, because a couple weeks ago we looked at the harmonic series. And certainly Bach's music does exactly that. It follows the strictures of what happens in nature, which is that in the harmonic series, the lowest part of the harmonic series are the biggest intervals. The middle part of the harmonic series are the next smaller intervals, in other words, arpeggio, and as we go further up in the harmonic series, the smaller intervals. These are seconds. Octaves, arpeggios, seconds. Well, in fact, that's exactly what Mr. Bach does in this wonderful beginning of the Brandenburg Concerto. And I'd actually like to talk a little bit about this wonderful viola part right here in the middle. If you are another kind of instrumental player, that kind of figuration is going to sound very similar to you, because we did talk about the idea of in previous days that our brass instruments had limitations that allowed them only to play the notes of the harmonic series. And in Bach's music, even though this instrument, the viola, is not limited to just playing the harmonic series, it's not infrequent that Bach gives that style of play to those instruments that are in the middle of the harmonic series. Here is a line of a tromba, some sort of trumpet instrument. This is the beginning, this is the line of the tromba part at the beginning of this piece of Bach's, which is actually the second Brandenburg Concerto. This is a tromba in F, so everything's going to sound a fourth above. But listen how closely this tromba line, this valveless brass instrument, sound, how similar it sounds to what the viola line above. Here's the viola line once again from the third Brandenburg. And here's this tromba line from the second Brandenburg. I'm going to leave out this second part here, and you'll see how similar it is. Here we go. Sorry, here we go. That would be how it would sound if it was playing this, but in fact, the 16th notes go straight up, so let's listen to it again. Now, with the inserted part in here, without the inserted part, and the viola part, I think you can see how similar they are in formulation. Here's that tromba part in the score of this second concerto at the very, very top. Let's listen to a little bit. I'm going to double the part so you can hear it, because it's a little hard to hear at the very beginning, but you'll certainly hear it when it starts to soar up here. So the beginning of Brandenburg number 2, listen to that wonderful tromba part at the very, very top there. Here we go. And here is the Brandenburg number 3, and I'll plunk out the viola part, this viola part right here in the middle. So similar in many, many respects. So interesting that these ideas, the acoustic ideas that we talked about previously, are so well represented in instrumental music of Bach's, so clearly reflecting the natural elements of the physical properties of the harmonic series. So enough with Brandenburg. Let's take a look at this wonderful two-part invention. It's one that everybody is very familiar with. Very familiar with. But however, in this case, well, we're used to seeing it this way, are we not? Yes, with the bass part and a treble clef, yet we see Bach writes a bass part and, what is this funny thing here? It's a C clef that's on the first line that is, in other words, a soprano clef. And so that, what looks to us should be an F, is actually a D. See where this flat is up here? That flat is on a B. So this is a soprano clef and a bass clef. So very interesting that he writes it in that way. We'll talk a little bit more about clefs now. I'm just going to take a bit of a digression. So basically, in music, there are three kinds of clefs, and we are more familiar with this treble G clef, which really began life as a G, showing where the G is, and this bass clef, which is really an F clef, a fancy-looking F clef that shows where this F is. But for the people in the time of Bach, the most common clef was this C clef, which now we take and it looks like this, which shows where middle C is. So this C clef can occur on any of these 5 lines to determine where the middle C is, depending on what your range is. So if you're spending most of your time singing high notes, you want a C that's low in the staff, so you don't have to spend too much time doing ledger lines. And so this would be your soprano clef. The next line is your mezzo-soprano clef. Here's the most common one that we're familiar with, the alto clef, the viola clef, so that the viola plays mostly around that middle C. Tenor clef, cellos and trombones and bassoons read that frequently. Unusual baritone clef, So these are all the C clefs that occur. In other words, the baritone sings mostly below middle C, so you would want a C that represents, that would be on the high part of the staff, so most of your notes would be in the 5-line staff. But what happens when you want to play much higher music than a soprano? You have an option, if you want to put your C down here, is to float a C clef down here. But instead of floating a C clef below the staff on the next leisure line or above the staff on this side to represent instruments that play quite a bit lower, well, you devise a clef that represents not the C, not a floating C, but the note that is next most important to that C, which would be a perfect fifth away. So you have what we call a G clef, a treble clef, that shows you where this floating C is down here, but it really is telling you where that perfect fifth above the C is. And on this side of the ledger, the same thing. You show a clef where the floating C is, but that shows you where the next most important note is to that C, a perfect fifth below that C, which is an F clef. So in olden days, how did all this play out? Well, before there were any clefs, you just, took a chance and wrote your notes and hoped people could figure out what the relationships of one note to another were. Well, that wasn't very efficient. So people figured out if you start adding some horizontal lines, then there's at least some points of reference that you know which notes are higher or lower than the other notes. Well, it got to a point where there were so many lines, you couldn't even tell what was going on in the middle. So how could you differentiate how that happened? Well, if you got a lot of lines here and you're thinking, back then, who are the people that are writing and reading the music? There are, of course, the men in the monasteries in the Catholic Church. And so everything, all notation evolves around the realities of those gentlemen. And what are those realities? Well, the realities is most of the guys, you notate a note where the lowest note that most of those men could sing. And obviously, what would be the best way to label that note? Well, give it the first letter of the alphabet, an A. So most men could sing that low. Some could sing lower, of course, but generally most of the men could sing low. And you add up the lines and you keep going up the scale until you get to the highest note that most young men or boys could sing, and that turns out to be this G up here. So the boys and some of the high tenors, that would be the note that could be not the tenors, but the young boys could certainly get up to that high G. But there's so many lines here. I mean, if you were to, if I would ask you what that note is, or what that note is, or what that is, you wouldn't be able to tell. You'd have to count up from A in order to get there. So what's the best way to figure out how to differentiate and get a better point of reference in the middle? Well, all you got to do is just take out that middle line. So now you got 2 staffs of 5, and it's much easier to figure out what these notes are in the middle of these 5-line staffs than in the middle of an 11-line staff. And what does that note in the middle note, end up being? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Finally, we understand why it's called a middle C, because it occurs between these 2 5-line staffs that began life as showing what a low common note was for men and a high common note was for boys. And of course, that's what we call nowadays the grand staff, where we put the, to show where this middle C is, this shared middle C is defined by the perfect fifth below, the F, and the perfect fifth above, the G. So a little digression into clef land. I think I'll skip ahead here just to save some time. In other words, if you're playing, if the music goes down from this G all the way down to this C down here, in order to avoid all these ledger lines, and frankly to save paper, this scale, descending scale, can be represented, and in fact, this is exactly the same as this, except going through different C clefs, going from the floating C clef, i.e. the G clef, to the floating C clef, i.e. the F clef, saving space and a much more efficient way of writing music, is it not? Just by simply changing your point of reference with these Cs. So treble, soprano, mezzo-soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass. Same scale. So a little digression into the world of clefs. Let's get back into our invention. So we're going to look at this piece and concentrate in one specific place. But I do want to draw your attention to the fact that just like we talked about in the Brandenburg Concerto, it is a constant repetition of the same darn motive. Now the bass. And once again, and then it just goes on and on and on, constantly repeating those two measures of the theme. Almost every single measure, every single two measures, has that theme to it, except in the moments of cadence, and we'll see about those in a second. Either it's right side up, or it's reversed upside down. Which occurs right here. So it's either right side up or upside down, but pretty much every two measures has that motive in it. Bach is so unbelievably economical. So we're going to take a look at one particular measure. We're going to take about 3 minutes and just talk about that one specific measure, measure 28. I'm going to play it for you now, and I want you to listen a little bit to see what happens in this measure. Once again. Notice anything interesting about that measure? Well, what's interesting is that, as we know in music, you have concordances and dissonances. The concordances are perfect unison, perfect fifths and perfect octaves, major and minor thirds, and major and minor sixths. And the dissonances in functional harmony, we talked a little bit about that when we talked about acoustics, are major and minor seconds, major and minor sevenths, and perfect fourths. These are all dissonant intervals. So how the heck does Bach get away with having 3 dissonant intervals in a row? Perfect fourth. Listen to that minor second. Listen to that major seventh. Perfect fifth. Well, as we all know in music, there are concordances and dissonances, and the dissonances are very, very highly regulated. And in Bach's time, there were only particular kinds of dissonances, and they could only be used in a very particular way. All dissonances had to resolve into a consonance in a very specific way. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds here, but here's a page that just lists all the different allowable kinds of dissonances: passing tones, neighbor tones, changing tones, sometimes called a cambiata, the Italian term, appoggiaturas, escape tones, suspensions, etc., anticipations, etc., etc. In functional harmony, those are the only allowable notes that can be dissonant, and they must resolve the consonants in a very regulated way. And in fact, take a look at this crazy thing. That's exactly what Bach does. Every single one of these 16th notes can be identified and labeled as either a consonant or a dissonant interval. And every dissonant note, every note that is categorized as a non-harmonic tone, whether it's a lower neighbor, a passing tone, an accented passing tone, or part of a cambiata, those are all non-harmonic tones. They resolve harmonically into the harmony of the measure, whether it's A minor, E major, or possibly D minor. It's extraordinary. I'm not going to, as I said, get into the weeds on this, but as you can see by this crazy little diagram, what's astonishing is that This diagram can be replicated in any piece of music that Bach ever wrote. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, that every single note that he wrote, whether it's a whole note, a half note, a quarter note, an eighth note, a 16th note, a 32nd, a 64th, 128th note, and if he wrote a 256th note, any of those notes can be labeled and described and explained either as a consonance or one of these dissonances. It's a remarkable thing to think about. It's like the laws of physics. You can't break them. I have a standing bet with any of my students, my private students, that if any of them can come up with an example of Bach breaking any of these rules, or the examples of unallowable voice leading or parallel fifths, I've got a bottle of 16-year-old Lagavulin single malt Scotch that is waiting to anybody who can show me an example of that. Well, in 45 years of teaching, no one's ever succeeded in that, and I don't expect ever to have to give up that Lagavulin. Anyway, here is our full invention. Let's listen to the whole thing, looking at the manuscript. And once again, keep in mind all of the repetitions of this two-measure thing that goes on and on and on, with the exception of the three places where the cadences, and then specifically listen as this measure 28 here goes by like a flash for those three consecutive dissonances. Here we go. Bach's Invention in D minor. Second statement, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, cadence, and once again. And inversion. Here we go. Here it is. Went by fast, but I'm sure you could hear it. Cadence. F major and D minor. An extraordinary piece of sublime genius, yet again by Mr. Bach, in two parts. So moving ahead, St. Matthew Passion. Well, here's the first page of the first movement of the St. Matthew Passion. Those of you who are familiar with the work know that it is composed for two separate orchestras. In other words, two groups that sometimes play together, sometimes play separately, sometimes play on their own. Here is the first orchestra. Here is the second orchestra. Here is a close-up of the first orchestra. You'll see this is a first flute part, second flute part, hautbois, first oboe part, second oboe, violin 1, violin 2, viola, our soprano, alto, tenor, and bass choir. Notice that they each have their own clef. The bass has the bass clef, tenor has the tenor C clef, alto has the alto C clef, and soprano has the soprano C clef. And then down at the bottom, the organ, which is also the cello and bass part. Notice that in this manuscript, the first flute and the first oboe play exactly the same music. The second flute and the second oboe play exactly the same music. Bach takes no shortcuts. He writes each part out. Not so the publisher. Publisher puts them all on the same line. Takes the shortcut, not Mr. Bach. Mr. Bach takes no shortcuts. And in fact, going back here to the full page, You notice Orchestra 1 and Orchestra 2 play exactly the same music. Mr. Bach doesn't say to Orchestra 2, to the manuscript, on the manuscript, just whoever's copying this, just copy the first orchestra part. No. Once again, he writes out every single note of every single part, even though it's exactly the same music. The labor, the unbelievable amount of time that it must have took simply just to write out the music. Forget about, once again, composing it. Simply writing it out is just mind-boggling. We don't know what it's like, us 21st century coddled musicians, to actually spend the time and have to do this kind of labor. So this is an internal part of the piece, a part of a wonderful recitative that occurs in the middle of the piece that we're going to spend time with. It's 5 lines of music that are repeated. In other words, there's 2 vocal lines. This is the tenor line of the evangelist and the bass clef line of the bassist who sings the role of Jesus. We have a violin 1, violin 2, a viola part, and a cello bass / continuo part. So these 5. So this is measure 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, etc., etc. So the 5 lines repeat on the page. And when it's written out, printed, it's the same way. So we're going to spend a little time and take a look at exactly what is going on in this wonderful recitative. Without getting into it at all, without even translating what's being said or what the context is, let's just listen to the music and see how it sounds. Here we go.
Der Hand mit mir in die Schüssel tauchet, wird mich verraten, des Menschensohn mir zwar dahin, wie von ihm geschrieben steht, doch wehe dem Menschen, durch welchen des Menschensohn verraten wird. Es wäre ihm besser, dass der selbige Mensch noch nie geboren wäre. Da antwortete Judas, der ihn verriet und sprach, wie ich's fragte. Er sprach zu ihm, du sagst, da sie aber aßen, nahm Jesus das Brot, dankete und brach's und gab's den Jüngern und sprach, nehmet, esset, das ist mein Leib.
Well, that's so beautiful. And you can tell, even not knowing what's going on here, that there's some drama going on. You can hear it in the intensity of the voices in spots, and also in the harmony that supports them. And I forgot to mention one thing. There is another character in this little drama. It's the character of Judas. He has one line here in measure 13 and 14. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening here. This recitative is at the table where the Last Supper is taking place, and Jesus is talking about what is about to happen after the Last Supper, which is that he's going to be betrayed. Woe to the man through whom the Son of Man hath been betrayed. Better for him if this very man had not been born. And Judas, who knows it's him, well, asks, "Is it I?" And Jesus says, "I didn't have to say it. I'm not saying it. You may say it, but not me. Thou sayest." And then Jesus talks about the Eucharist. He talks about taking the bread, that this is my body, and then later drink of this wine, it is the blood of the New Testament. So it's a very, very dramatic moment in this passion and, in fact, in all of Christianity. And dramatically, specifically about talking about his betrayal. This one will betray me, but woe to the man who hath been the Son of Man who hath been betrayed. And the evangelist once again says, answered Judas who betrayed him. So interestingly enough, we'll see exactly how Mr. Bach talks about that. So let's deconstruct this in a few minutes. The piece begins in a very unstable way with a third of the chord in the bass. It doesn't begin in a happy, clearly undramatic way. It begins by putting that third in the bass. We know something's up. We don't know what it is. And evangelist says, well, he answered and spoke. And as soon as Jesus speaks, what happens? Oh, those violins and the viola, they give him a harmonic halo. Whenever Jesus speaks, he gets this beautiful string halo that accompanies his texts. And Jesus goes on and talks about what's going to be happening here at the Last Supper. And when he talks about, what does he talk about? He will betray, and it talks about betrayal. What happens? Well, what's betrayal other than having a dominant seventh with a seventh in the bass? There's nothing that can be more unstable and irritating than that. And woe to him. What happens with woe to him? Vehe, woe to the man. And what's the most dramatic, woeful sound in the Baroque times? Well, the most dramatic, woeful sound in Baroque times is the diminished triad, and that's exactly what happens here. Woe to the man. Once again, talking about verraten wird, being betrayed. How are you betrayed? By a diminished seventh interval. But would it be better? Yes, it would be better, especially if you're better in major. Not to have been born, yes, with a tritone. Yeah, if you're not going to be born not with a tritone. And what does the evangelist say here at the top of page 2? Well, he answers, Judas. How does he answer? Judas, the one who betrayed him. Once again, how is he betrayed? He's betrayed first with a diminished triad, and then with getting that dominant seventh in the bottom again. And what does Judas say? Is it I, Rabbi? There's a fellow who asks a question knowing what the answer is, right? That third in the bass, very, very, very spooky, is it not? And what happened? Well, Jesus said unto him, he said, you said it, not me. But listen how Bach portrays what Jesus is feeling while he's saying, you say us. Is there sadder music that has ever been written for a moment that is possibly the most cited instance of betrayal in all of humanity. Jesus says, you said it, and this is how I feel about what you said. Well, life goes on, but when they had eaten, Jesus took the bread, gave thanks, and beautifully in wonderful F major, Jesus talks about this. Please take, eat, this is my body. There's no greater drama in opera than occurs in these 20 measures of music, simply sung, 2-3 characters, small orchestral ensemble. Let's listen with that in mind. Here's Jesus' halo. Talks about betrayal now. Once again, woe to the man. He betrays him.
Es wäre ihm besser, dass der selige Mensch noch nie geboren wäre.
Yes, this is the guy who betrayed him, diminished seventh. Judas, question. Jesus' woe. Ah, but there's redemption. The bread of his body. Once again, there's no music, there's no drama that's more greatly represented than in these beautiful measures here. And no other composer who does it better than the great Johann Sebastian Bach. So I hope you enjoyed this little survey, getting into the weeds and the very specifics of his motivic and harmonic expertise, but also his great artistry and humanity in dealing with words, spiritual elements, and the great art of Johann Sebastian Bach. I'd love to hear your comments and observations, and also your personal experiences with Bach. Everybody has a personal relationship with the music of this great man. So thanks again for being here, and let's have a nice little conversation about the joy of Mr. Bach. Thank you.